On a sunny day in Oak Ridge, Karen Turner spotted a new family having a picnic in the park and felt uneasy. Despite their cheerful appearance, her growing concern led her to call the police. When the officers arrived, Karen learned the family were well-respected figures, a U.S. congressman and a renowned pediatric surgeon. Her well-meaning but mistaken call sparked a wave of criticism online, leaving Karen to confront her actions and their impact. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. It was a radiant, sunny afternoon in the tranquil suburban enclave of Oak Ridge, a neighborhood that often seemed untouched by the rush of the outside world. The local park, a vast stretch of green nestled harmoniously between neat rows of charming, well-kept houses, was bustling with activity. The laughter of children rang out like music, their playful shouts echoing joyfully through the towering trees. Groups of children darted across the lush grass, their exuberant energy creating a lively atmosphere, while their parents relaxed nearby, some lounging on benches, others laying out picnics under the comforting shade of the ancient oak trees. It was an idyllic scene, the kind of day that made Oak Ridge feel like the quintessential place to build a life and raise a family, where every moment seemed to be a snapshot of perfect suburban contentment. Among the park's visitors was Karen Turner, a woman who had called Oak Ridge home for many years. In her mid-40s, with neatly styled blonde hair and a crisp white blouse that reflected her meticulous nature, Karen carried herself with a sense of pride and responsibility. As a longtime resident and a dedicated member of the community, she had grown to know almost everyone who frequented the park. From the early morning joggers who pounded the trails with determined rhythm to the families who gathered on weekends for playful escapes, Karen was familiar with them all. She saw the park as an extension of her community duties, a place she helped to maintain in its safe and orderly state. As she strolled along the well-worn path she had taken countless times before, Karen's eyes were drawn to a family setting up a picnic on the far side of the park, close to the playground. There was nothing particularly unusual about a family enjoying the park on such a splendid day, but something about this group piqued Karen's interest. She noticed the father first, a tall black man in his late 30s, who was laughing heartily as he spread a blanket on the grass. His wife, an attractive woman with natural curls framing her face and an inviting smile, was busy unpacking a basket filled with what appeared to be a carefully prepared meal. Their two children, a boy and a girl, were chasing each other around the blanket, their giggles punctuating the air with innocent delight. Karen slowed her pace, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the family. It struck her as odd that she didn't recognize them, given how familiar she was with most of the park's regular visitors. This family was enjoying themselves, but a small, insistent voice in Karen's mind whispered that something was amiss. Perhaps it was the fact that they were new, or maybe it was something less tangible, an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite place. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, observing as the father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders, her high-pitched squeal of joy cutting through the ambient noise. When the mother noticed Karen's gaze, she waved politely, her smile genuine and warm. Karen, caught off guard, forced a smile in return, but the gnawing unease persisted. As Karen continued her walk, her thoughts kept drifting back to the family. Were they new residents, recent arrivals in the neighborhood, or merely visitors passing through on a pleasant afternoon? These questions buzzed in her mind, refusing to settle. As she circled back toward the playground, she noticed a few other familiar faces: Mrs. Jenkins, a retiree who walked her dog in the park almost daily, and the Martins, a young couple who were gently pushing their toddler on the swing. Deciding to satisfy her curiosity, Karen approached Mrs. Jenkins, who was seated on a bench, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Karen remarked, taking a seat beside her. "Oh yes, perfect weather," Mrs. Jenkins replied without looking up from her knitting. Karen hesitated for a moment, then nodded in the direction of the family. "Do you know them, the ones with the picnic?" Mrs. Jenkins glanced up briefly, squinting as she tried to focus on the family in question. "No, can't say I do. They must be new around here." Karen murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Jenkins. "I just don't remember seeing them before." Mrs. Jenkins shrugged, her interest waning. "People come and go, Karen. It's a park, after all." Karen nodded absently, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at her, refusing to dissipate. She stood up, excusing herself, and resumed her walk. Yet instead of the usual sense of peace the park brought her, she felt a growing anxiety with each step. The family appeared happy, but what if they weren't just another ordinary family enjoying a day at the park? What if they had other intentions? The park had always been a sanctuary, a safe space, and Karen was determined to keep it that way, unspoiled and serene. By the time she reached the opposite end of the park, Karen had convinced herself that it wouldn't hurt to be cautious. She pulled out her phone and quickly dialed her friend Lisa, who lived just a few blocks away and was also a vigilant member of the neighborhood watch. "Hey Lisa, are you busy?" Karen asked when Lisa answered. "Not really." "What's up?" Lisa replied, her tone curious yet concerned, sensing the urgency in Karen's voice. Karen stood at the edge of the park, her eyes fixed on a family she had never seen before. They were sitting on a checkered blanket, unpacking a picnic basket filled with sandwiches and fruit. It was a seemingly innocent scene, but something about it made Karen uneasy. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the family just didn't seem to belong there. "They're having a picnic, but there's something off about them," she muttered to herself, before deciding to call Lisa, her closest friend, for some reassurance. When Lisa picked up, Karen quickly described the scene, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Lisa, I'm at Oak Ridge Park, and there's this family here I've never seen before. They're having a picnic, but I just get this strange feeling. I know it sounds weird, but they just seem out of place." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "A strange feeling," Lisa finally replied, her tone curious but unconcerned. "What do you mean by that?" Karen hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know, it's just, who has a picnic in the middle of the day like this? And I swear they're not from around here. They look like they don't belong." Lisa chuckled softly, trying to ease Karen's nerves. "Karen, it's a public park. People come here all the time to relax and have picnics, especially on a nice day like this. Maybe they're just visiting the area or passing through." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Maybe Karen conceded, though her unease lingered. She glanced back at the family. The father was animatedly telling a story, the children laughing along, and the mother watching with a contented smile. It was an image of a happy family, yet Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But what if they're here for something else? What if this isn't just a normal picnic? Lisa sighed, her tone turning serious. "Karen, you're overthinking this. Not everything is a cause for concern. Just try to relax and enjoy your time at the park." Karen nodded, though Lisa couldn't see her. "Yeah, you're probably right. I'm just being paranoid." She ended the call, but the sense of unease didn't go away. As she watched the family from a distance, she couldn't help but feel that something was out of place. What if her instincts were right? What if there was more to this situation than met the eye? Her heart pounded as she wrestled with her thoughts. After a few minutes of silent deliberation, Karen made a decision. She told herself it was probably nothing, just a figment of her imagination, but she couldn't take that chance. It was better to be safe than sorry. With a deep breath, she reached for her phone again, this time dialing 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" The operator's voice was calm and professional, a stark contrast to Karen's growing anxiety. Karen's voice trembled slightly as she explained the situation. "Hi, I'm at Oak Ridge Park, and there's a family here that seems out of place. I know it might sound strange, but they just don't seem like they belong here, and I think someone should check it out, just in case." The operator asked for more details, and Karen described the family as best she could, trying to keep her voice steady. When the call ended, a wave of mixed emotions washed over her. Relief that she had done something, but also guilt. What if she was wrong? What if she had jumped to conclusions? She walked back to a bench near the playground, her eyes never leaving the family as she waited. The distant sound of approaching sirens sent her heart racing, the reality of the situation sinking in. This was it. She was about to find out whether her instincts were spot on or if she had made a terrible mistake. Karen sat on the bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as the sound of sirens grew louder, each passing second adding to her anxiety. She tried to appear calm, but inside, her thoughts were a chaotic mix of doubt and determination. What if she had been wrong all along? What if she had misread the situation entirely? But then again, what if she was right? She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off, and the safety of her community was too important to overlook. The first police car pulled up to the edge of the park, and Karen felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Two officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they surveyed the area. Karen stood up, her heart pounding, and waved them over. The officers approached her quickly, one of them, a tall man with a firm, no-nonsense demeanor, taking the lead. Are you the one who called?" he asked, his voice steady and authoritative, his gaze sharp as he studied Karen's anxious face. Karen nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I called." "Yes, that was me," Karen replied, trying to steady her voice, though she could feel it trembling slightly. "Thank you for responding so quickly. I appreciate it. Over there." She gestured toward the picnic area where the black family was seated, seemingly unaware of the escalating situation. "There's a family. I don't recognize them, and they've been behaving in a way that makes me uneasy." The officer followed her gaze, his expression neutral as he surveyed the scene. "Acting suspiciously." "In what way?" he asked, his tone calm but probing. Karen hesitated, her heart beating faster. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something about the family had triggered a sense of discomfort in her, though they weren't overtly doing anything wrong. Still, the uneasy feeling gnawed at her, refusing to be dismissed. "I know it might sound strange," she admitted, struggling to articulate her concerns, "but I just had this bad feeling. They don't seem like they're from around here, and I thought it would be safer to have someone check it out rather than ignore it." The officer nodded thoughtfully, though his expression remained unreadable. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll go talk to them. Please wait here." As the officers made their way across the park, Karen's eyes followed them, her stomach twisting with a mix of fear, uncertainty, and guilt. She hadn't intended to cause a disturbance or draw attention, but the growing tension around her made it clear that the situation was quickly becoming a spectacle. Other park visitors had started to notice, their gazes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern, and Karen could feel the weight of their silent judgments pressing down on her. She watched as the officers approached the family. The father, who had been casually tossing a ball with his son moments before, noticed the officers' approach and straightened, his playful demeanor fading into a more serious one as he exchanged a glance with his wife. Karen couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the confusion, and then a guarded calm settled over the father's face. When one of the officers asked for identification, the father complied without hesitation, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his driver's license, which he handed over. The mother, her expression composed but tinged with unease, followed suit, her eyes never leaving the officers as she watched them scrutinize the IDs. The children, sensing the shift in mood, huddled closer to their parents, their earlier playfulness now replaced by a quiet apprehension. Karen bit her lip as she observed the scene, her anxiety growing with each passing second. The moment seemed to drag on endlessly, and she could feel the eyes of the other park-goers occasionally flicker in her direction. She wasn't sure if they realized she was the one who had made the call, but the thought of their potential judgment made her want to shrink into herself. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, trying to contain the nervous energy coursing through her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers handed the IDs back to the parents. They exchanged a few more words, and Karen saw the father nodding in response, his face still calm, but now tinged with a hint of seriousness. The officers, who had initially approached with an air of authority, seemed to have shifted their demeanor to one that was almost deferential, leaving Karen puzzled and uneasy. What had they discovered? Who exactly were these people? If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As the officers began walking back toward her, Karen braced herself, preparing for the inevitable conclusion that she had overreacted and called attention to something that had no basis in reality. When the officers reached her, their expressions were difficult to read, but their tone had changed. It was softer, almost cautious. "Ma'am," the lead officer began, his voice carrying a note of understanding. "We've spoken to the family. Everything is in order. They're just here for a picnic." Karen felt a wave of embarrassment flood through her, her cheeks flushing with shame. "Oh, I see," she stammered, her voice small. "I'm sorry if I wasted your time." The officer gave her a long, measured look before continuing. "Just so you're aware," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "the man you were concerned about is a U.S. congressman. His wife is a highly respected pediatric surgeon." Karen's eyes widened in shock, her embarrassment deepening as she processed his words. "A congressman? Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am. They're very well known in the community and have been visiting Oakdee for years." Karen felt a sinking sensation in her chest, a heavy weight of regret settling over her. She had called the police on a family simply enjoying a day in the park, a family who not only had every right to be there but were prominent, respected members of society. The very people she had feared might pose a threat were, in fact, the least likely to do so. Seeing the turmoil on Karen's face, the officer softened his tone further. "I'm sure your intentions were good," he said gently, "but it's important to be certain before making a call like that. Things could have taken a very different turn." Karen nodded numbly, unable to shake the overwhelming feeling of guilt that now consumed her. She had misjudged an innocent family based on nothing more than an unfounded sense of unease, and the consequences of that mistake would linger with her for a long time to come. Karen nodded numbly, her throat constricting as she struggled to find the right words, or any words at all, to respond. The officers, sensing her inability to speak, gave her a brief, almost indifferent nod before turning and making their way back to their patrol car. As the sound of their footsteps faded and the car door slammed shut, Karen was left standing alone, rooted to the spot. The weight of her actions, the enormity of what she had just done, began to crash down on her with an overwhelming force. It was as if the air around her had thickened, making it hard to breathe. She watched, almost in a daze, as the police car pulled away from the curb and disappeared, its departure leaving behind a suffocating silence. Karen's gaze drifted back to the family she had been so quick to judge. They had resumed their picnic, but the carefree atmosphere that had once surrounded them was gone, replaced by a heavy, unspoken tension. The father, whose eyes had briefly met hers with a look she couldn't quite decipher, now had his arm wrapped protectively around his wife. She was speaking softly to their children, her voice too low for Karen to hear, but the somber tone was unmistakable. The children, who had been laughing and playing just moments before, now sat quietly, their eyes downcast, as if they were trying to make sense of what had just happened. A deep pang of regret pierced through Karen, sharper than anything she had ever felt before. What had she done? Her mind raced as she tried to rationalize her actions, but no comforting answers came. She had always seen herself as a good person, someone who cared deeply about her community, someone who did the right thing, and someone who acted out of genuine concern for the safety of others. But now, as she stood there, feeling the cold tendrils of doubt creeping into her heart, she wasn't so sure anymore. Was her concern truly genuine, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface, something she had never confronted before, an unconscious bias, perhaps, or a fear she had never fully acknowledged? As she turned and walked away from the park, her steps felt heavy, each one more difficult than the last. The image of the family lingered in her mind, refusing to fade. Their quiet dignity, even in the face of her unwarranted suspicion, haunted her. She knew, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was going to be long and painful, a reckoning with herself, with her beliefs, with the person she thought she was. The next day, the incident at the park was all anyone in Oak Ridge could talk about. Word spread quickly, fueled by the presence of bystanders who had captured the entire interaction on their phones and posted it on social media. Karen had hoped that the whole thing would blow over, that people would forget, but the opposite happened. The video went viral, attracting attention from local news outlets and sparking a heated debate online. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, texts from friends, emails, and a barrage of social media alerts. At first, she tried to ignore it, hoping that if she didn't look, it wouldn't be real. But curiosity, mixed with a morbid sense of dread, eventually got the better of her. When she finally opened her phone, she was met with hundreds of comments, most of them harsh and unforgiving. This is exactly what's wrong with America. Racial profiling at its finest. She should be ashamed of herself. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her heart sank as she scrolled through the comments, her face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and guilt. She had never intended for things to spiral out of control like this. She wasn't a racist, at least. She had never thought of herself as one. She had just been trying to protect her neighborhood, or so she told herself. But now, seeing the vitriol directed at her, she couldn't help but feel the sting of their words. The more she read, the more she began to question everything she thought she knew about herself. It wasn't just strangers online who were talking. Her friends and neighbors were too. She received a message from Lisa, the same friend she had confided in the day before. "Karen, what happened yesterday? People are saying you called the cops on that family in the park. Why didn't you tell me?" Karen stared at the message, her mind racing. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had only been acting out of concern, but deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. The truth, as much as she hated to admit it, was that she had made assumptions based on the color of that family's skin and their unfamiliarity in her world. Meanwhile, the black family at the center of the incident, Congressman David King, his wife Dr. Renee King, and their 2 children were grappling with the fallout in their way. They had encountered racism before it was an unfortunate reality of their lives, something they had learned to navigate with strength and grace. But that didn't make it any easier. What was supposed to be a peaceful, joyful day spent with their children had turned into yet another painful reminder that no matter how successful, how respected, and how integrated they were into their community, they could still be reduced to nothing more than the color of their skin in the eyes of others. David King sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled deep within him. Across from him, Renee sat with a look of exhaustion and resolve on her face, her coffee untouched. The kids were in the next room, playing quietly, but both parents knew that they had sensed the tension in the air. They were too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to know that something was wrong. David broke the silence, his voice heavy with the weight of the question that had been hanging over them since the previous day. "What do we do now?" he asked, his eyes searching Renee's for an answer. Renee sighed deeply, running a hand through her curls as she considered her response. "We do what we always do," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "We keep going. We don't let this stop us. We don't let them win." Her words were firm, but there was an undercurrent of weariness, of frustration that this was a conversation they had had too many times before. David nodded slowly, his grip on the mug tightening as he drew strength from his wife's resolve. "You're right," he said, his voice a little stronger now. "We keep going, but it shouldn't have to be like this. Not in 2024. "No, it shouldn't," Renee agreed, her eyes meeting his with a look of shared understanding and unspoken determination. "But until it isn't, we fight. For us, for our kids, for every family that has to endure this kind of ignorance and hate." They sat in silence for a moment longer, drawing comfort from each other's presence. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they knew they would face it together, just as they always had. The video was everywhere on social media, in news reports, and in conversations that buzzed throughout the community. Renee could feel the anxiety radiating from David as they sat together at the kitchen table. "Our kids are going to see it," she said quietly, her voice tinged with concern. "People are going to see it and think that we're either victims or, worse, that we're dangerous." She reached across the table, her fingers gently wrapping around David's hand. "We're not dangerous, David," she reassured him, her eyes searching his for a sign that he believed her. "We're just people who had a bad experience. But we can't let that one moment define who we are. We've worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let this be the thing that overshadows everything we've accomplished." David nodded, though the lines of worry etched into his face remained. His mind was heavy with the exhaustion of constantly having to prove himself, of always fighting to be seen as equal in a world that too often saw him as less. "I know," he said, his voice thick with weariness. "But I'm tired, Renee. Tired of always having to prove that we belong, that we're just as good as anyone else." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Renee squeezed his hand, her grip firm as if she could transfer some of her strength to him. "I know you're tired," she said, her voice soft yet resolute. "But we have to keep pushing forward for our kids, for everyone who looks up to us. We can't let this break us, David. We faced worse, and we've come out stronger every time. We have to do it again." They sat in silence, the weight of their reality pressing down on them. It was a burden they had carried for years, the unspoken understanding that being black in America meant carrying an extra load, no matter how far they climbed the ladder of success. But they were determined, as always, to rise above it. They had to show their children, and everyone else watching, that they could overcome even this. Later that day, David received a call from his campaign manager. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable as she informed him that the video had gone viral, not just locally but across the nation. News outlets were picking up the story, and there was mounting pressure on David to address the situation publicly. The video struck a chord, reigniting conversations about racial profiling and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. David knew he couldn't stay silent, even though every part of him wanted to move past the incident and focus on his work. But he also knew that silence would be a disservice to all those who faced similar injustices daily without the platform or the power to speak out. The people who looked up to him needed to hear his voice, to see him stand tall in the face of adversity. That evening, he and Renee sat down together, their laptops open in front of them, and crafted a statement. They chose their words carefully, balancing their anger with a call for unity and understanding. The statement was calm and measured, but undeniably powerful. When David posted it on his social media accounts, he acknowledged the incident, expressed his deep disappointment, and called for the community to come together not to attack or blame, but to learn and grow from the experience. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the post had garnered thousands of likes and shares. The comments section was flooded with messages of support, not just from the Black community but from allies who understood the importance of standing together. It wasn't the first time David had spoken out on issues of race, but this time felt different. This time it was personal. Meanwhile, Karen's life was unraveling. The more she tried to explain herself, the deeper the hole she seemed to dig. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. She received a call from the Oak Ridge Neighborhood Association, the very organization she had been so proud to lead. They were asking her to step down from her position as chair of the safety committee. They framed it as a temporary measure, a pause until things calmed down, but Karen knew it was more than that. It was a polite way of distancing themselves from her, of saying that she had become a liability. At home, the tension between Karen and her husband Mark was growing. At first, Mark had been supportive, reassuring her that things would blow over. But as the days passed and the criticism mounted, his patience began to wear thin. "Karen," he said one evening, his voice edged with frustration, "maybe it's time to just lay low for a while. Stop talking about it. The more you try to explain, the worse it gets." Karen felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined not to cry. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "I was just trying to look out for our community. I thought I was doing the right thing." Mark sighed, his expression softening as he looked at his wife. "I know you were," he said gently. "But you have to understand how it looks to them. It's not just about one call, Karen. It's about the history behind it, the assumptions that come with it, the fear that people like David and Renee have to live with every day." Karen knew he was right, but it didn't make the truth any easier to accept. She had always seen herself as a good person, someone who cared deeply about her community and the people in it. But now she was being forced to confront the reality that her actions, however well-intentioned, had caused real harm. She had hurt people, good people who didn't deserve it. As the days turned into weeks, Karen found herself withdrawing more and more. She avoided the park, where she used to love taking her morning walks. She avoided her neighbors, who had once greeted her with warm smiles but now seemed to avert their eyes when she passed. She avoided the very community she had once felt so connected to, the people she had once felt so responsible for. The isolation was suffocating, and it forced Karen to reflect deeply on who she was and who she wanted to be. She began to realize that the problem wasn't just what she had done, but what it revealed about her, a truth she had been too blind or too proud to see. She had always prided herself on being open-minded, but now she saw that there were blind spots in her thinking, biases she had never acknowledged, and until she confronted them, she knew she would never be able to truly make amends. The more Karen dwelled on the events that had unfolded, the clearer it became that there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. The path forward was fraught with challenges, but she knew it was one she had to take. She couldn't change what had already happened. Those moments were etched in time, forever beyond her reach. But she could confront the pain and guilt that weighed heavily on her heart. She could seek to understand the lessons hidden in her mistakes. With a deep breath, Karen resolved to start by reaching out to the family she had wronged. It was a daunting prospect, one that filled her with dread, but she knew it was the only way to begin mending the damage she had caused. The thought of facing their anger or disappointment was terrifying, yet she was determined to try. Karen felt she owed them an apology, a sincere effort to make things right, not just for their sake, but for her sense of integrity and for the community she had always claimed to care so much about. As the days turned into weeks, the story of what had transpired at Oak Ridge Park spread far beyond the confines of the local neighborhood. What had initially been a community issue now became a matter of national concern. News outlets across the country picked up the story, framing it as yet another instance of racial profiling, a familiar but painful narrative in America's long history of racial tensions. Although similar stories had been told countless times before, each new incident struck a raw nerve, reigniting feelings of anger and frustration among those who had lived through similar experiences. For Karen, the media attention was suffocating. Every time she turned on the TV or glanced at her phone, there was a new headline, another opinion piece, another heated discussion about the incident. The weight of it all bore down on her, crushing her spirit. The walls of her home became a refuge, a place where she could hide from the relentless scrutiny. She rarely ventured outside, and when she did, she kept her head low, avoiding eye contact, fearful of encountering someone who might recognize her and judge her harshly. Meanwhile, the Kings found themselves thrust into a spotlight they had never sought. Congressman David King was no stranger to the public eye, but this was different. The scrutiny they faced was not just professional, it was deeply personal. Their family's life was dissected and analyzed, and their motives were questioned by those who doubted the authenticity of their pain. Support poured in from many, but there was also a harsh backlash from certain quarters, as some speculated about their intentions and criticized how they handled the situation. The experience was a stark reminder of the precarious position they occupied, not only as public figures, but also as a Black family navigating the complexities of race in America. One evening, as the exhaustion of the past weeks pressed down on them, David and Renee sat quietly in their living room. The children, after days of restless nights filled with difficult questions, were finally asleep. The silence between David and Renee was heavy, not just with fatigue but with the unspoken fears and doubts that had been building up. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" David's voice broke the quiet, his tone laced with weariness and frustration. Renee looked up from the book she had been pretending to read, sensing the weight behind his question. "What do you mean?" she asked gently, though she suspected she knew. "All of it," David replied, his gaze distant. "The work, the constant struggle. Sometimes it feels like no matter how hard we try, it's never enough. We're still seen as a threat, as if we don't belong in the very country we've dedicated our lives to serving." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Renee sighed, closing her book and setting it aside, her heart aching at the truth in his words. "I know it feels that way," she said softly, "but we can't give up. If we stop fighting, what does that say to our children, to the people who look to us for strength and leadership?" David nodded slowly, though his expression remained conflicted. "I just wish it didn't have to be this hard. I'm tired, Renee, tired of always having to prove that we're good enough, that we deserve to be here." Renee reached out and took his hand, her grip firm but tender. "I know, David, I'm tired too. But we have to keep going. We owe it to ourselves, to our children, and to everyone who has come before us. We can't let one woman's ignorance define who we are or what we stand for." David met her eyes, finding solace in her unwavering resolve. Her words resonated with him, reminding him of the strength they had always drawn from each other. She was right, they couldn't let this moment break them, no matter how much it hurt. They had to continue, not just for their family, but for the community they represented and for the countless others who faced the same battles. The following day, David received an unexpected phone call from a producer at a major national news network. They were offering him a platform, a chance to speak directly to the nation about the incident at Oak Ridge Park and the broader issues of racial profiling and systemic racism that plagued the country. It was an opportunity to transform their pain into a powerful message, to advocate for change on a scale that few could ignore. At first, David hesitated. The idea of reliving the traumatic events of that day in front of millions of viewers was daunting. He wasn't sure if he had the emotional strength to go through it all again. But after discussing it with Renee, he knew what he had to do. They both understood that staying silent was not an option. They had a responsibility to use their voices to turn this painful chapter into a teaching moment that could potentially spark real change. On the day of the interview, David and Renee sat together in their living room, their home transformed into a temporary studio by the bustling camera crew. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but beneath it was a shared sense of purpose that steeled their resolve. They were doing this not just for themselves, but for their children, for their community, and for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly because of the color of their skin. As the countdown to the live broadcast began, they took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next, determined to make their voices heard in a world that so often tried to silence them. The interview began with the host providing a comprehensive summary of the events that had culminated in this pivotal moment. As the footage from Oak Ridge Park played on the screen, the tension in the room was palpable. David watched in silence, his heart heavy with a mixture of anger, sadness, and a deep-seated resolve. The images brought back the painful memories of that day, memories that he had tried to push aside but now confronted head-on. Despite the emotions swirling within him, David remained focused. He knew this interview was more than just a recounting of events. It was a platform, an opportunity to convey a message that had to be heard. When the camera turned to him, David took a deliberate, steadying breath. He looked directly into the lens, his eyes reflecting a mix of determination and the weight of the responsibility he felt. "What happened to my family at Oak Ridge Park?" He began, his voice firm but laced with the pain of the experience, "is not an isolated incident. It's something that happens far too often in this country. It serves as a stark reminder that despite all the progress we've made, the journey towards true equality and justice is far from over. This isn't just about one incident or one family, it's about a pervasive fear and deep-rooted prejudice that still haunts our society. We need to have these difficult conversations, to confront our own biases, and to work together actively and relentlessly to create a more just and equitable world for everyone." Renee, sitting beside him, nodded in agreement before adding her voice to the conversation. Her tone was calm and measured, but there was no mistaking the resolve behind her words. "This experience has been incredibly painful for us, but it has also been eye-opening in ways we never anticipated. It has underscored the importance of community, of standing up for one another and supporting each other, especially in the face of injustice. We can't allow fear to divide us, to drive wedges between us. Now, more than ever, we need to come together, to stand united, and to fight for what is right. Because if we don't, then nothing will ever change." As the interview progressed, David and Renee spoke candidly and with heartfelt sincerity about the challenges they had faced, their hopes and dreams for a better future, and the critical role that education and empathy play in the fight against racism. Their words were powerful, resonating deeply with viewers across the country. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People praised their courage, their strength, and their unwavering commitment to justice. The interview had sparked a dialogue, a nationwide conversation that many felt was long overdue. When the cameras finally stopped rolling and the crew began packing up, David and Renee exchanged a look that spoke volumes. There was a sense of relief, yes, but also a sense of accomplishment. They had taken a painful chapter of their lives, a chapter filled with fear, anger, and hurt, and turned it into something meaningful, something that had the potential to inspire change. They hoped that their words, their story, would not just fade into the background but would continue to resonate, to spark the difficult but necessary conversations that needed to happen. Meanwhile, back in Oak Ridge, the impact of the interview was immediate and profound. Karen, who had been following the story from the beginning, watched the interview from the quiet solitude of her living room. As she listened to David and Renee speak so eloquently and passionately about their experience, her emotions became a whirlwind: guilt, shame, and a newfound admiration all swirling within her. She realized, perhaps for the first time, just how deeply she had underestimated them. The Kings were not just victims of a terrible injustice, they were leaders, advocates, and role models for a cause that was bigger than any one person. Karen knew that her initial apology, as heartfelt as it had been, was not enough. It could never be enough. She needed to do more to change, to confront the biases that had led her to make that fateful call in the first place. The King's words had struck a chord deep within her, awakening a resolve to make amends not just to them, but to herself and her community. She understood that this was about more than just righting a wrong. It was about personal growth, about becoming the kind of person who stands against injustice rather than perpetuates it. A week passed since the incident at Oak Ridge Park, and the initial buzz surrounding the video had begun to die down. But for Karen, the time had been anything but quiet. She had spent those days in deep reflection, grappling with the uncomfortable truth that she had been wrong. The realization weighed heavily on her, but she knew that the only way forward was to make things right, or at the very least, to try. With a nervous heart and a determination she hadn't felt before, Karen decided to reach out to the Kings once more. She spent hours researching, trying to find the best way to contact them. Eventually, she found the congressman's public contact information. With trembling fingers, she began to compose an email. Every word felt like a struggle. She agonized over each sentence, wanting desperately to express her deep regret without coming across as defensive or insincere. She knew that no matter how she phrased it, the words would never truly capture the depth of her remorse. But she had to try. After several drafts, she finally settled on a message that she hoped conveyed her feelings as honestly as possible. Dear Congressman King and Dr. King. She began, her hands shaking slightly as she typed. My name is Karen Turner. I am the person who called the police at Oak Ridge Park. I want to express my deepest apologies for my actions. I realize now that my call was rooted in fear and prejudice. And I understand that it was wrong. I am truly sorry for the distress I caused your family. Please know that I am committed to learning from this experience and working towards becoming a more empathetic and understanding person. I would be grateful for any opportunity to speak with you and apologize in person. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, Karen Turner. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As she hit send, Karen felt a wave of anxiety wash over her, but also a sense of resolve. She knew this was just the beginning of her journey toward change, but it was a step she was determined to take. Karen hesitated before hitting send, her finger hovering over the button as a storm of emotions churned within her. A mix of dread, guilt, and a faint glimmer of hope made her pulse quicken. She knew that the apology she was about to send might not be enough to undo the damage she had caused, but she also knew she had to try. The past few days had been a whirlwind of self-reflection and regret, and though she feared rejection, she was determined to make an effort. Finally, with a deep breath, she pressed send, knowing that there was no turning back. Days passed slowly, each one filled with an anxious anticipation that gnawed at Karen's nerves. Then, finally, the reply came. It was from David King. As she opened the message, her heart raced. David's words were measured, thanking her for reaching out and acknowledging her attempt to mend the rift. He agreed to meet with her, though he made it clear that it would be a private meeting, with no involvement from the press. The glimmer of hope in Karen's heart flickered a little brighter, but it was quickly tempered by a surge of anxiety. Facing David and Renee in person would be the most challenging part of this entire process. The meeting was arranged at a small, quiet cafe in a neighboring town, far removed from the media frenzy that had once surrounded them. On the day of the meeting, Karen arrived early, her stomach in knots. The cafe was nearly empty, with just a few patrons scattered about. She chose a table in the corner, away from the large windows, hoping for some semblance of privacy. As she waited, she rehearsed what she would say, though the words seemed to tumble over one another in her mind. When David and Renee arrived, they greeted her with a mix of warmth and reserve. There was no hostility in their demeanor, but Karen could sense the cautious distance they maintained. They sat down across from her, the small table between them feeling like a fragile bridge over a deep chasm. Karen's hands trembled slightly as she began to speak. Her voice was soft but steady. "Thank you for meeting with me. I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for what happened. These past few weeks have been incredibly difficult. But they've also given me time to reflect. I've come to realize that my actions were rooted in deep-seated biases that I wasn't even fully aware of at the time. I should have listened more, learned more, and most importantly, acted differently. I understand now that I can't undo the hurt I've caused, but I want to do everything in my power to make amends. I hope to use this experience as a catalyst for personal growth and to help others understand the impact of their actions." David listened intently, his expression serious but not unkind. He seemed to weigh her words carefully before responding. "I appreciate your apology, Karen. It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong, especially in a situation like this, where the consequences of those actions have been so significant. This is a step in the right direction, but as you know, it's just the beginning. True change requires ongoing effort and a commitment to continuous learning and understanding." Renee, who had been quietly observing, nodded in agreement. Her voice was calm but firm as she added, "We're willing to meet you halfway, Karen. But we also hope that you'll continue to work on yourself and find ways to contribute positively to your community. The road to healing is long and often difficult. But it's worth traveling if it leads to greater understanding, empathy, and respect." Tears welled in Karen's eyes as she listened. Their willingness to meet with her, to give her a chance to make things right, filled her with a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I will do my best to live up to the commitment I've made. This experience has been incredibly eye-opening, and I hope that it can be a force for positive change, not just for me, but for others as well." As Karen left the cafe, she felt a mix of relief and the weight of the journey that lay ahead. The meeting had given her a renewed sense of purpose, but she was under no illusions about the challenges that awaited her. Repairing the damage she had done would take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. However, she was determined to take responsibility for her actions and to work toward creating a more inclusive and understanding community. As the days passed, Karen threw herself into learning and self-improvement. She attended workshops on unconscious bias, read extensively on the subject, and even began volunteering at local organizations dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion. She knew that actions spoke louder than words, and she was committed to proving, through her deeds, that she was serious about making amends. Meanwhile, David and Renee continued their work both in their professions and within their community. The incident had shaken them to their core, but it had also strengthened their resolve to fight for justice and equality. They used their experience to educate others and to spark important conversations about race, privilege, and the need for systemic change. A few weeks later, Karen was invited to speak at a community meeting on the topic of unconscious bias. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, and as Karen took the stage, she felt the weight of their expectations. She knew she had to be honest, no matter how difficult it was. "I called the police that day because I saw something that made me uncomfortable," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I've since realized that the problem wasn't with what I saw, it was with how I interpreted it. I made assumptions that were unfair and harmful, and for that, I am truly sorry. I'm here today because I want to learn and to be better. I know I can't change the past, but I hope that by being here, I can start to make amends and contribute to a more understanding and inclusive community." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Soon, the entire room joined in, not in a celebratory manner, but in a gesture of support and encouragement. Karen felt tears prick at her eyes, but this time they were tears of hope and gratitude. After the meeting, several people approached Karen, thanking her for her honesty and courage. They shared their own stories and their struggles with bias and understanding. It was a small step, but it was a chance to rebuild trust and to learn from her mistakes. As Karen left the community center that evening, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and that there was much more work to do, both within herself and in her community. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, the King family continued their tireless efforts to promote justice and equality. The incident had been a painful chapter in their lives, but they were determined to turn that pain into something meaningful. They knew that the road to change was long and often fraught with obstacles, but they were committed to walking it together, hand in hand, as a family. They were determined to use their experiences as a catalyst for change, to educate others, and to continue fighting for a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. As the weeks turned into months, the town of Oak Ridge slowly began to heal. The rift that had once divided the community, a rift fueled by suspicion, fear, and misunderstanding, started to close as people came together with a renewed sense of purpose. The incident that had shaken the town to its core became a catalyst for change, sparking conversations that had long been avoided and inspiring new initiatives aimed at fostering greater understanding and inclusivity. Karen found herself at the heart of this transformation. She continued to attend the community meetings, each one offering her new insights and perspectives. With every session, she felt her understanding deepen and her awareness sharpen. She knew that her journey was far from over. The road to personal growth and redemption was long and winding. But Karen was determined to keep moving forward, to keep learning and growing from the mistakes. She had made a mistake that she would never forget, but was committed to using as a stepping stone toward a better future. In the end, what mattered most was not the mistake itself, but what she did afterward. It was her actions, her willingness to face her shortcomings and make amends, that defined her. And that, she realized, was the true measure of a person's character. In the days following the community-wide interview, a palpable shift began to take hold in Oak Ridge. The candid discussion led by the Kings had ignited something within the town, a collective desire for reflection, for change. Conversations that had been avoided for too long were now taking place in living rooms, coffee shops, and local meetings. The people of Oak Ridge were beginning to acknowledge that their comfortable bubble was not immune to the broader issues plaguing the rest of the country. They were waking up to the reality that prejudice, whether overt or subtle, could exist even in a place like Oak Ridge, and that they all had a role to play in addressing it. Karen, too, felt this shift deeply within herself. The guilt that had weighed her down since the incident was now interwoven with a growing resolve to be part of the solution. She knew that apologizing, while important, was not enough. Words alone could not erase the harm that had been done. They needed to be followed by meaningful action. It was time for her to step up and contribute to the healing and growth of her community. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 6 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. One evening, Karen sat down with her husband, Mark. He had been supportive of her throughout the ordeal, but there had been a distance between them, a gap that she knew needed to be bridged. She needed to talk to him, to talk, and ensure that they were on the same page as they moved forward together. "Mark, I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Karen began, her voice steady but filled with the seriousness of the moment. "I know I made a huge mistake, and I can't undo it. But I don't want to just sit here feeling guilty. I want to do something that makes a real difference." Mark looked at her, his expression thoughtful and full of concern. "What do you have in mind?" Karen took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I've been reading about racial bias and how it influences our decisions, often without us even realizing it. I want to start a dialogue in our community, something more formal and sustained than just a meeting or two. I was thinking about organizing a series of workshops or discussions where we can all learn together without judgment. Mark nodded slowly, absorbing her words. That sounds like a good idea, Karen. But do you think people will participate? I mean, this is Oak Ridge. We've always seen ourselves as a welcoming community, but maybe we've been too complacent. I know, Karen replied, her tone reflecting the gravity of the situation. But that's exactly why we need to do this. We've been hiding behind that image of ourselves for too long. It's time to face the reality of our biases, even if it's uncomfortable. And I'm willing to put myself out there, to admit my failings, if it means we can all grow from this. Mark reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. I'm proud of you, Karen. It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong, and even more to try to make it right. Karen squeezed his hand, feeling a surge of gratitude and determination. Thank you. I just hope it's enough. With Mark's support, Karen set about organizing the workshops. She reached out to local leaders, including David and Renee King, to help guide the discussions. To her surprise and relief, they agreed to participate. They saw it as an opportunity to continue the important conversations they had started and to help the community move forward in a positive direction. The first workshop was held at the community center, the same place where the initial meeting had taken place. On the evening of the event, Karen stood at the front of the room, her nerves buzzing with anticipation. She wasn't sure how many people would show up, but she was determined to make a difference, no matter how small the group. As the room began to fill, Karen was relieved to see a mix of familiar faces and new ones. Some were neighbors who had witnessed the incident at the park, while others were people she had never met before. But all of them were there for the same reason: to learn, to listen, and to grow. Karen started the workshop by sharing her own story. She admitted her mistakes and the painful lessons she had learned. She spoke about the unconscious biases that had influenced her actions and how she was committed to challenging those biases moving forward. It was difficult to be so vulnerable in front of her community, but she knew it was necessary if real change was to occur. David and Renee King spoke next, offering their perspective on what had happened and the broader issues at play. They talked about the impact of racial profiling, not just on individuals but on entire communities. They emphasized the importance of empathy, education, and open dialogue in overcoming prejudice and building a more inclusive society. The workshop continued with small group discussions, where participants shared their own experiences with bias and discrimination. The conversations were sometimes uncomfortable, but they were honest and necessary. People were beginning to understand that change didn't happen overnight, but through sustained effort and a willingness to confront difficult truths. By the end of the evening, there was a palpable sense of hope in the room. The participants had taken the first step toward understanding and healing, and they were committed to continuing the journey together. The workshop provided a space for honest dialogue, and it was clear that the community was ready to face its challenges head-on. As the workshops continued over the following weeks, more and more people joined the effort. The community began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to each other were now engaging in deep, meaningful conversations, challenging their assumptions, and supporting each other in the process. For Karen, the workshops were just the beginning. She became more involved in local initiatives focused on diversity and inclusion, using her experience as a catalyst for change. She knew she would never forget what had happened, but she also knew that she couldn't let it define her. Instead, she chose to let it inspire her to be better, to do better, and to help others do the same. The Kings continued their work both in their professions and within the community. They had turned a painful experience into an opportunity for growth, not just for themselves, but for Oak Ridge as a whole. They were proud of the progress the community had made, But they knew there was still much work to be done, and they were committed to leading that work together. In the end, the incident at the park became a turning point for Oak Ridge, a moment when the community was forced to confront its shortcomings and take meaningful steps toward becoming more inclusive. It wasn't easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but the people of Oak Ridge were ready to face them together. Karen often reflected on how much had changed since that day at the park. She was no longer the person she had been, someone who acted out of fear and assumption. She had grown, and so had her community. In that growth, she found hope for the future. One sunny afternoon, as she walked through Oak Ridge Park, Karen noticed families of all backgrounds enjoying the space together, laughing, playing, and sharing in the simple joys of life. It was a sight that filled her with a deep sense of peace. Oak Ridge wasn't perfect, but it was on its way to becoming a place where everyone truly belonged, and that, Karen knew, was something worth fighting for. As we wrap up today's discussion, take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. How has today's content impacted your perspective? What new insights or lessons can you apply to your life moving forward? I'd love to hear from you. Comment below with one key takeaway from this video and share one thing you plan to practice or change in your daily life based on what you've learned. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us create more content that inspires and uplifts. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.